Can I, okay. Hello. We have the usual last panel of the day drop-off, but we will try to work our way through that, and hopefully people will join us. My name is David Dayen. I am a journalist. In just 2 weeks' time, I will take over as the executive editor of the American Prospect magazine, and I'm also author of a forthcoming book on the role of monopoly in daily life, which will be out next year. We on this panel are going to take a deeper look at the political impact of digital platforms. I'm eager to hear the reactions of our panel to the presentation and observations about how to deal with a set of companies that have both political power through their size and influence, and as well as a gatekeeper function on political speech and speech of the press. So we have an excellent panel. We have Francis Fukuyama of Stanford University, Claire Wardle of First Draft and TED, Ellen Weintraub, a commissioner on the Federal Elections Commission, and Barry Lynn, whose reputation precedes him. So we're going to start with some presentations. I'm going to get some reactions from the panel, and then we'll instigate a discussion, and then we'll give ample time for Q&A. So I'm going to start with Francis Fukuyama, and he has some slides as well.
No, I do not.
You don't?
Okay. I do not have slides.
I'm sorry. He does not have slides.
Yeah. Okay, so thanks very much. I am the co-director of something called the Project on the Internet and Democracy and the Internet at Stanford that I co-direct with Nate Persily. Nate, unfortunately, could not be here. You may know that he's one of the two people, along with Gary King, that was tasked with trying to open up Facebook's data to academic researchers. But we have a lot of projects now going on at Stanford that are mostly in line with the sorts of things that Josh and Nolan were describing in terms of basic empirical research on what the impact of social media and the internet was on democracy, not just in the United States, but worldwide. But that's not my topic. I actually want to make a case that, well, this is the conclusion I have come to as a result really of work I did on the Knight Commission on Trust, Media, and Democracy last year, that actually antitrust is the only way to ultimately solve the problem of content moderation on the internet. If the issue for democracy is fake news, conspiracy theories, hate speech, and the like on social media, I ultimately think that although regulation is theoretically possible, I think as a practical political project, it's simply not going to work. And that leaves really antitrust as the major remedy. I know in the morning panels there is some skepticism about whether antitrust could be used for all these other purposes, but I do think actually that one of the areas in which competition is important is not just in the economy, but in the market for ideas and for speech. And if that market is not kept competitive, that's got big consequences for democracy. So there are obviously a lot of attempts to regulate speech on the internet. The Europeans have done a lot of things like the NetzDG law in Germany. A lot of Americans think they've overstepped with that. I at least think it's good that they're doing something because if they don't get it right the first time, they'll make adjustments and you'll work your way to that. In the United States, obviously, there's been this effort over the last couple of years on the part of the platforms and then other organizations and civil society groups to pursue a kind of typically American path of self-regulation. So I want to talk about both the American and the European approaches first. Self-regulation, I think, is completely inadequate. There have been a couple of different approaches to it. One is to try to use international human rights law somehow as a way of setting standards for both protecting and promoting free speech on the internet. I don't actually think that this is going to work because, Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is an extremely broad article, and it does not remotely provide the kind of guidance that actual real regulation would require. So for example, how many of you know what this is? Okay, so this OK sign is sometimes just an OK sign, but it's also increasingly been used by white nationalists as a way of signaling their presence to one another. And so a couple of weeks ago, when the Estonian government, there's a new government, and they have a new right-wing anti-immigrant, anti-EU party that's entered their coalition. When they were sworn into the parliament, they all made this sign, right? And whether this sign is just, and so they were accused of being white nationalists, and what they said was, oh, Barack Obama has made this sign, and they showed pictures, on the internet of Barack Obama doing this, and so therefore it's okay. Well, this is a kind of contextual judgment, and quite frankly, Facebook, over the past year, 18 months, has been trying to moderate content, trying to regulate itself. It has been making all sorts of very complex judgments as to whether this is okay, whether Pee-Pee the Frog is okay, whether a lot of other things that could be interpreted as hate speech really are hate speech. I don't envy them having to do this, but I think that it's very hard to get any guidance from this, certainly out of Article 19. Another procedure is trying to use civil society, multi-stakeholder groups. Facebook has created an internal Facebook Supreme Court where if you're arguing over what this means, you can appeal it to this court, and then there'll be an internal juridical process that will determine whether this is a white nationalist sign or just an OK sign. I think this is also a hopeless enterprise because Facebook basically does not have the legitimacy ultimately to make this kind of decision. And I actually think that the groups, the civil society groups that are being recruited into this kind of an effort are not fully representative of the whole political spectrum that exists either in the United States or in any of the particular countries involved. Breitbart is never actually included in the consultations, the multi-stakeholder consultations as to what's unacceptable speech and what's not. And so I think those efforts are going to founder. Now, when you get to the question of more overt government regulation, there's actually one approach that's quite successful, and that's public broadcasting. And it's funny that nobody talks about public broadcasting as a regulatory mechanism, but it is. It's particularly successful in Northern Europe, where you have ZDF or the BBC or their equivalents in Scandinavia or the Netherlands. And they actually deal with the problem of fake news because they paternalistically decide what is good news and what's not. They will interrupt a sports match to tell you about international crisis. And so they're basically feeding their publics what they regard as something other than fake news. And as my colleague Shanto Iyengar has shown in a whole series of studies that he did in the early 2000s, it actually works. And so if you look at the level of knowledge, citizen knowledge in places that have good public broadcasters, in Scandinavia, for example, it is significantly higher than in a place like the United States where we basically let market forces determine what people listen to. Problem with this approach is that it doesn't work everywhere. The biggest problem has been in Southern and Eastern Europe, where the opening up of media markets has actually led to the capture of the public broadcasters. So the pioneer in this respect was Silvio Berlusconi, that managed to capture the Italian public broadcasters as part of adding them to his Mediaset empire, but now this is a pattern that's being repeated and it's interesting because as traditional legacy media declines, it becomes less and less a value proposition for people that want to make money, but it is a big opportunity for people that want to exert political influence. And so newspapers and TV channels in the Czech Republic, in Hungary, in other countries tending towards populism have been seeing the acquiring of their media, legacy media channels by oligarchs, basically, that can then use them for political purposes. And so that approach, I think, is also problematic. Now, I want to get into the specific issue of the First Amendment. And the assertion was made on the previous panel that social media and the platforms are protected by the First Amendment. And I would suggest that's probably largely true, but not completely. In this respect, I think it's important to look at some of the history of regulation of media, legacy regulation, because it provides some interesting precedents for the regulation of the digital space. Now, typically, newspapers have not been heavily regulated. I mean, democratic governments don't censor in the sense of controlling, in a minute way, content. In most cases, they do it through licensing, through subsidies, that sort of thing. In this sphere, newspapers have been relatively lightly regulated, but this was not the case with broadcast media, radio and television, which from the beginning was recognized to be a rather different kind of medium because of the concentration of power. So those of you that are old enough like me to remember the days when there were just 3 TV networks, over the air broadcast TV networks, this was the day in which the US government asserted a right to actually control the content that those broadcast channels carried. There's a long history to this. It starts with the Radio Act of 1927, the Communications Act of 1934. By the way, I'm a political scientist. I'm not a lawyer, so I know there's a lot of lawyers in the room, so I stand to be corrected on some of these facts. But the original Communications Act that created the FCC actually said that one of the objectives of this new body would be to promote public interest, not simply the commercial interest of the broadcasters. And that was interpreted over the years by the FCC as giving it a mandate to control the content of things that were put on the air by broadcasters. This was challenged in the courts on a number of constitutional grounds, on the basis of the Takings Clause, on the basis of the Interstate Commerce Clause. Both of those were struck down. The most important one, obviously, though, was the objection that this violated the First Amendment. There's a history to this where there was a case that went before the Supreme Court, the Red Lion case in 1969, and actually it has a lot of resonance for today because Red Lion was a very conservative, kind of conspiracy-minded radio show that was accusing people of being part of a larger communist conspiracy and so forth. And the question was whether the FCC had the right to force the channel to provide countervailing information. There was also a statutory amendment to the Communications Act, Section 315, that was interpreted as giving the FCC the right to do this. And so, in other words, it was a statutory basis for regulation that was not that dissimilar to the public broadcast standard that was being used in Europe, that the government had an interest in promoting public interest and not simply the private interest of the stations. And this is what led to the Fairness Doctrine. And I think that the thought that I will leave you with is that if you look at the history of the Fairness Doctrine, it is a mess. And it shows the difficulty of actually having the government, as a practical matter, try to regulate a media platform for content, right? So the Fairness Doctrine actually was pushed mostly by liberals. They didn't like the fact that you had these conservative crackpots, in their view, spouting, nonsense. But conservatives thought that this was biased against them. And this was in the days when AM radio was just getting its start. Rush Limbaugh, Fox News was still a gleam in Roger Ailes' eyes. But as those media outlets began to grow, I think the politics of the Fairness Doctrine became increasingly partisan. And so Republicans wanted a repeal of the Fairness Doctrine, and Democrats defended it. Eventually, and this is where the lawyers will have to tell me exactly how this stands right now, there was never a Supreme Court case that really tried to establish the constitutionality of the Fairness Doctrine. It was rescinded by the FCC itself in the 1980s. The Democrats tried to legislate it by statute several times. Subsequently, it was vetoed once by Ronald Reagan, once by Bush 41, and after that, they basically gave up. So there is no fairness doctrine, but the legacy that I think it leaves you with is just showing in a polarized, partisan political atmosphere, it is impossible to decide on what is fair and balanced, right? That's the slogan of Fox News, and any liberal would say that's not fair and balanced, that's highly partisan. But what then is fair and balanced? Is it fair and balanced to kick Alex Jones off of YouTube, right? I think that is a political, it's an intensely political judgment that is, very complex, and you can make arguments for and against it, but there is certainly no clear public interest standard that will tell you what is, completely out of bounds and what is not. So the reason I get to antitrust is the following. I have for a long time believed that actually the platforms should act like media companies. They shouldn't hide behind this pretense that they're just platforms, they're just neutral platforms. I think that Section 230 that was referred to earlier has been widely misinterpreted as actually promoting their neutrality as a platform. It's just the opposite. Section 230 of the CDA was put there in order to allow them to curate the material on their platforms without fear. The government couldn't interfere, but the fear was that private litigation would stop them from doing takedowns and things like that. And Section 230 is put there to protect that ability for them to act basically like the New York Times or like the Wall Street Journal or any other media company that wants to say this is acceptable and this is not. So I think they need to do this, but you have this problem of size. They are not like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or the newspaper industry, in which you have actually a big variety of alternative political voices out there that you can choose between. Nobody complains about the New York Times not publishing Alex Jones, right? It's perfectly within its scope to do that, but they do complain about Facebook doing it, and I think with a certain justice, because Facebook has become, or YouTube and Facebook have become kind of universal public platforms. They are assuming a quasi-public role in our political system, and as a result, what they do matters a lot. If they take down Alex Jones, it's really not like the Times not publishing him. It really prevents him from reaching, a significant audience. So that's how I ended up thinking that antitrust is actually an important remedy here, because if you decide that all of these different approaches to regulation in our highly polarized political situation in the United States today, it may work in Europe, but in the United States today, we are so highly polarized, I cannot imagine an FCC in the future that could agree on what is fair and balanced coverage on the part of an internet platform or an FTC or any other federal agency. And if that's the case, what you got to do is make these platforms smaller. I have no idea how to do that. That's why I came to this conference, to learn, how you'd proceed. But the conclusion that I'm left with is, if you want to solve the content moderation problem on the internet, you have to address the size problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe later we'll talk about the 1996 Telecom Act and the media consolidation therein, because that was as consequential as the 88 Fairness Doctrine takedown. All right, we're going to Claire Wardle.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. I do about 3 of these conferences a week, and it's actually really refreshing to be in a room where I hardly know any of you. So we're breaking down the silos, so that's exciting. I'm an academic by training. I'm a social scientist. I'm a qualitative researcher. But for the last 10 years, I've been a practitioner. I got frustrated that only my mum was reading the things that I was writing. And for the last 10 years, I've been deeply steeped in this world of misinformation. So I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a political scientist. And I'm not an American, as you can tell from my accent. And so when I thought, what could I add to this conversation? Many of you are very smart and know this stuff deeply. I thought what I could add at 4 p.m. is a number of images that will remind us what this stuff looks like and the complexity of this stuff and the global interconnected nature of this stuff. Because I think if we don't, it's very easy to sit in rooms like this and be very distanced from that. So that's really what I wanted to do today. So I lead an organization called First Draft, and for the last 4 years, we've been working around the world helping monitor mis and disinformation connected to elections, doing a lot of throwing spaghetti at the wall to try and work out what sticks, because my frustration is we know so little about this space, we've all been discussing this, how can we do something and actually find data? So for example, one of the projects we worked on was in Brazil. We had a coalition of 24 newsrooms, and we had a central WhatsApp number. We received 250,000 WhatsApp messages from Brazilians asking us to check whether this was true or not. That's now the most powerful data set we have around disinformation on an encrypted message app. So if we want to do this, we've got to start trying to find ways around this, because I agree, one day we might get some data from the platforms, but I worry it won't be anytime soon. So as I said, we did these different projects. Some were specialized newsrooms where we would set up a group of journalists monitoring this kind of content and then sending out alerts to platforms and newsrooms. And others were these collaborations with newsrooms, teaching them how to find, verify, and then responsibly report this. We have real challenges now. I really enjoyed many of your comments, but most journalists today have no idea how to responsibly report on misinformation. And in many ways, they are disproportionately amplifying and giving additional oxygen to rumors that previously would just sit around the breakfast table and your mum would go, ooh, Alec, have you heard that about the new incels? No, pass the tea. Now, somebody goes straight to their mobile phone and Googles incel and finds all this information that previously they couldn't. So the interconnected part of this is what's so important. And so, as we showed, we would write these reports and we would have normally competitive newsrooms with their logos sitting side by side. And so what we found from that is we can't use up resources asking different newsrooms to actually monitor this kind of content. And bringing newsrooms together allowed them to collaborate and make decisions about responsible reporting. And that collaborative model is something that I would love to see us work in other spaces. So for example, around anti-vax content, could we have the WHO, the CDC, and the Nigerian Health Ministry sitting side by side? So there's a whole host of things that we could be working on. But one of the things I wanted to stress from working so much outside the US is to understand the complexity of how these platforms operate. And so understanding free basics and what that looks like in Brazil, so that most Brazilians are only accessing information on WhatsApp because it doesn't cost them anything. But what that means is they never click on a link to go and verify that in Google, because that costs them data. So within WhatsApp, they're just sharing screenshots, and that's the only information they have. And on the flip side, there are paywalls to access quality media. So in that environment, what does that look like? And what does it look like in an environment when we talk about internet shutdowns, but we have free basics where that's the only way that people can access information? So I know this conversation is focused on the US, but whatever you do here will have a disproportionate impact on the rest of the world. And for us to remember that in all of our conversations is all that I would ask here today. And the other thing, I know that you know this, but encrypted apps are the future. When Mark Zuckerberg talks about a pivot to privacy, it's because he already knows there has been a chilling effect on speech. Facebook newsfeed looks nothing like it used to, even a year ago. In places like Indonesia, where the use of Facebook was off the scale, everybody's moving to Facebook Messenger because the chilling effect of regulation in Indonesia. And so what that means is we're now facing a situation where the speech that we're so concerned about is moving into spaces that we just can't see. And I am a huge proponent of encrypted spaces in communities, but what does it mean when we haven't figured out and we haven't provided the necessary resiliency for populations to understand how to navigate a polluted information ecosystem when they have leapfrogged right over laptops and email addresses? They've gone straight to their digital smartphone and a WhatsApp number. So the reason that Facebook acquired WhatsApp was because there's no way that everybody around the world would ever have an email address to come onto Facebook. But everybody would have a mobile number, and so WhatsApp was the answer. So understanding these dynamics is so critical, and understanding that it's not just WhatsApp. That's what the New York Times and the Washington Post is obsessed with. But when you start looking around the world and understanding that in Myanmar it's Viber, in Russia it's Telegram, in South Korea it's KakaoTalk, TikTok. Are we talking about TikTok? I mean, we're having conversations and we're talking about Facebook, Twitter. That's not our future, and what I worry about is that we're regulating for 2016 in the US. And we're not actually thinking about what the future looks like and what it looks like globally. And so this is an updated dynamic map that Poynter makes that I just use actually all the time, which is different interventions around the world that governments are taking around misinformation. And some of them are from threats, some of them to really problematic regulation. And if we actually look at the scale of what's happening and how you're seeing different governments copycat what's happening in other countries, that's my fear. I agree, Germany was good, they got out there, they did something, we realized very quickly that it was problematic, but by that time Singapore was like, oh, that looks nice, we'll have a bit of that, but with no actual understanding of what that looks like in a completely different regime. So one of my biggest issues here is about the terminology. So we talk all the time about problematic content or harmful content with no understanding of what this is. I created this in my pajamas in February 2017 because I was so frustrated by the term F*** news, which I refused to use because it's A, doesn't explain the complexity of this space in any degree, and secondly, it's been weaponized and used against a free and independent press. But just trying to say to people, this isn't about what's true or false. The biggest challenge we have is the weaponization of context. 2016, it was much more about fabrication. Now it's much more about weaponization of context. The most effective piece of disinformation online are that which have a kernel of truth to it, which makes it even harder for all the things that you just described to make decisions about content moderation. I also published this, was trying to distinguish between misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Genuine information, but the sharing of private to public makes that harmful. But then the term harm, we haven't grappled with the term harm. I mean, I'm looking at a room of lawyers, but the fact that we're using terminology that is so slippery on something that it's so troubling is what concerns me. And this was created by Full Fact. It's their pagoda of harms. Ridiculously simplistic. All of these should be torn apart, and we should have undergraduates or even graduate students spending semesters and semesters trying to work on this stuff. This is us just trying to put something out to start a conversation, but we're so focused on political disinformation. And one thing I'd say about the panic right now about vaccinations is at least we're starting to think about real-world harms. And if that means that we can start thinking about interventions around that type of speech, try that type of speech, and then say, what does that look like afterwards? So back to the previous panel, we used Lucid panel data in 12 countries, and we asked people what they would search for if they had to learn, would I vaccinate my child? And so we've got hundreds of search strings from around the world, and then we asked them to send us screenshots. When you start seeing qualitative data from around the world, you realize how powerful it is. So very quickly, this was the most shared image during the Brazilian election. It's a genuine image of ballot papers, but the rumor circulating on WhatsApp that these have been pre-programmed for Haddad. This is another piece of information that goes viral constantly, looking at different statistics around crimes. Any fact checkers in the room? What's the problematic word? Federal. So because most crimes are state crimes, federal crimes involve a border. So the problem with this is how do we label this and what do we do about it? So just finally, I just want to say this stuff is genuine, but it is harmful. This was circulating before the midterms. This stuff, how do we think about how the stuff that's online moves offline? These were lots and lots of memes around the coming second civil war in the US. If we don't understand the severity of this type of speech, and I understand everything you're saying, but my worry is if we just think about antitrust as the answer, how do smaller platforms stop us when we have these types of problems around speech? So that's just what I wanted to say, that we need to be mindful of this when we're thinking about regulation. It's much more serious than simply some words on a page. Thank you.
All right. Ellen, and you can stay here if you want. You can go up.
Yeah, I'm just going to stay here, I think. This is comfy for me if everybody can see me.
All right.
Okay. Do I have that? All right. Want to make sure everybody can see me and hear me, yeah? Okay. So I am also sort of an anomaly in this room. I'm not an antitrust specialist. In fact, when I was originally invited to do this, and then I got a reminder, and it said something about antitrust conference, I said, what? How did I end up on an antitrust conference? That's not what I do. That's not who I am. I am a lawyer. I am not an academic. What I am, and this is, I think, also fairly unusual in this room, is I'm a regulator. I'm the chair of the Federal Election Commission, and we actually do regulate some of what we've been talking about here. Not all of it, not the antitrust aspects, but the transparency aspects of internet advertising is something that we actually have jurisdiction over. So I want to give, everybody's been talking about different metrics for how to measure the extent of the issue or problem, or however you want to describe what we're talking about here. So I have some statistics also. Digital ad spending, got this from Axios, in the United States will grow 19% in 2019 to $129 billion. Okay, so that is real money. And it is 54% of the estimated total US ad spending. So more than half of ad spending is moving online. Now, if you look at political spending, which is what I am particularly interested in, based on where I come from, political spending and political advertising goes up with every election. That's a given. In 2018, in the midterms, there was about $4 billion spent on advertising. Now, most of it was not spent online. About $3 billion of it was spent on local broadcast television, which I think is that's going to be declining over the years. About $900 million went to online advertising, and while that is a smaller percentage, it represented a 260% increase for online spending for political ads over the last midterms in 2014. So there is just an exponential rise in the amount of money that candidates and political parties and others who are trying to influence elections and policy are spending online. So this is really a huge arena. Now, where do we come in? Well, we're in the disclosure business. So we are in the business of making sure that you know where this information is coming from. And obviously in 2016, people's antenna got raised because it turned out that a lot of the information that people were getting about politics was coming from Russia. Well, we didn't expect that, but according to Facebook, 126 million people on Facebook were exposed to propaganda that was generated in Russia. Another 20 million got information on Instagram. And then there were over 1,000 videos posted to YouTube, and there were a bunch of tweets. But just between Facebook and Instagram, there was 156 million people who were exposed to this information. Now, the number of voters in that election was only 137 million. So I don't know if there was a complete overlap there, but that's pretty wide penetration. Did it make a difference? Nobody knows. I've heard all sorts of people talk about this. I've heard people say very authoritatively that, obviously it must have had an impact. And other people say, oh, it couldn't possibly have had an impact. And honestly, I don't think anybody knows. But it's a problem either way. I am deeply concerned about the possibility that foreigners are trying to influence and affect who gets elected in the United States, because there's actually a law against that. There is a law that says foreigners are not allowed to spend money to influence elections in the United States, and that is at the federal, the state, and the local level. The Federal Election Commission generally doesn't have jurisdiction over state and local elections, except when it comes to foreign spending. That's how important it was. Congress gave us jurisdiction over the whole ball of wax. So I was interested to hear, and I can't wait to read the panel, the white paper that was discussed in the last panel, that one of the suggestions was that foreign ad spending would be disclosed. I think that would be great. I would love to see it disclosed, because then we can go after them because it's all illegal. So that is of great concern to me, but of course it's a tricky business, regulating even what kinds of ads have to have these kinds of disclaimers on them. Now, Facebook, of course, ran into some huge headwinds once this information came out as to how much information was being sent into this country from Russia to influence our election. And it turned out that they were actually accepting ads, payment for ads in rubles, which should have been a tip-off. And I think they've got that now. They're not doing that. So they have, to their credit, come up with their own plan for, now they are offering a lot more information about who's behind the ad spending, particularly when it comes to political ads. And they really got out in front of us on this because, I was again interested when I saw the FEC show up in the alphabet soup on one of the former panelists' charts, and more towards the independent side. Well, thank you very much. We are an independent agency. I don't know how much anybody in this room knows about the FEC, evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans by statute, or rather no more than 3 of the 6 commissioners who are supposed to be there can be of one political party. In practice, it usually works out to 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans. Right now, we're down 2 commissioners, and we have 2 Republicans, 1 Democrat, and 1 independent who sits on the Democratic side of the table. So, we have a huge ideological battle that goes on a daily basis at the FEC over how much we are going to regulate. and what ads constitute the kind of ads that we can regulate. The Supreme Court says we can regulate express advocacy and the functional equivalent of express advocacy, ads that no reasonable person would look at and not understand that they were political ads. And believe me, you wouldn't have a hard time when you saw these ads trying to figure out which ones were campaign-oriented and which ones weren't, and yet we continue to have massive disagreements about this at the FEC on a weekly basis. So, sorry, my phone was buzzing. One of my colleagues was trying to call me right now to find out about, what's the latest disagreement. We are in the process of trying to do a rulemaking on the smallest possible aspect of this, just trying to improve the disclosure of who's behind ads that say directly vote for and vote against online. And the reason that we are only carving out this itty-bitty part of it is that I threw, half a dozen to a dozen different proposals on the table, and I could not get buy-in from my colleagues to even begin the rulemaking on anything other than this. Now, this is an issue, this business of disclaimers and disclosure of online political ads has been around for years. We put it out for public comment a number of years ago and got 6 comments as to whether we should launch a rulemaking on this. And then, we tried it again, and we got 7 comments. And then after the Russia story broke, I said, let's put that one out for comment again. And suddenly we got 150,000 comments. Everybody wants us to regulate this, and yet it is very hard to get that regulation done. So I appreciate that Facebook has, and some of the other platforms have gotten out in front of this and tried to do their own better disclaimers on their ads. They are struggling too, though, with the definitions. And while they were initially very resistant to any form of regulation, I think they've kind of got a love-hate relationship going with it now, and have, in some instances, actually said that they would welcome more federal involvement in helping them define what exactly is it that they are supposed to be putting these disclaimers on. There's a couple of good bills in Congress, both the Honest Ads Act and the Disclose Act would help us get better information about what we're seeing online, and I am a supporter of both of them. But guess what? We're polarized at the FEC, and Congress is also polarized and is having trouble getting these laws passed. So I think that there is certainly cause for regulation. There's cause for concern, particularly when it comes to ads that are being placed and information. It's not just ads. There is this whole media campaign that went on that involved bots and placing misleading information out there that looked like it was from an American citizen, and then it would get shared by other people, and people were talking to bots online, not even realizing they were talking to bots. Protests were organized by people in other countries who were masquerading as Americans. This is a huge area of concern, I think, for us, because while most of the time what we do is limited by First Amendment concerns, when it comes to foreign intervention, no one other than Brett Kavanaugh, former judge of the D.C. Circuit and now on the Supreme Court, when faced with this question, wrote an opinion that said, this isn't a First Amendment question when you're looking at foreign intervention in our elections. It's a question of whether we get to define who is part of our political community. And the answer is, yes, we do. And I think because of that, we have a basis in law and in the Constitution for moving forward and for writing stronger laws and stronger rules that will help protect us. So I will stop there.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Barry right now, and then we'll get some discussion.
Thank you, David. And wanted to actually start off by thanking Guy and Luigi for organizing another terrific, a third straight, really terrific conversation about these issues here at Stigler. And actually, just as an aside, I mean, given the topic of this conference, I thought it was a really nice touch of you guys to arrange for the partial demolition of the Chicago Tribune building next door. In terms of illustrating the state of journalism in America today, that was really nice. I'm proud of this community of people. We have, compared to what we saw 2 years ago in this discussion, we've seen a phenomenal advance in understanding the problem. and understanding and sort of pushing the discussion about what to do about it. This is true in the academy, it's true among business leaders, it's true among the public, it's true in our political debate. You know, just in the last 2 weeks, we've seen a couple of really huge things. I mean, this article that Chris Hughes published in the New York Times, it was an amazing article, had an amazing effect. The case, decided Monday in the Supreme Court, Apple versus Pepper, written by Brett Kavanaugh. That's an important. It may prove to be a very important case, and it may prove to be a very important sort of illustration of what's in Brett Kavanaugh's head. But I believe that we have some ways still to go. This panel is supposed to focus on the effects of platforms on democracy. Luigi this morning asked us, he said, a century from now, will we be able to say that we saved democracy? And from what I've seen here today, thus far, I think the answer will be no, we did not. Instead, what we have seen in a number of these discussions is a resistance to admit the magnitude of the threat that monopoly, that these platforms pose to democracy and to our individual liberty. We've seen this in these documents that have been put forth. We see this in these presentations. There have been a couple of exceptions. A couple of people have put forward pretty strong points, but we know this, there are many ways in which monopolization threatens democracy. This includes, as we spoke about in this venue 2 years ago, soaring inequality. It includes, as we talked about last year, the degradation of the citizen through addiction to these technologies, through the isolation that these technologies, as they are now used, to sort of impose upon people. It's important to add that, in terms of national security, as I've written about extensively, consolidation has made complex international systems subject to cascading, sudden, catastrophic crashes. It has, consolidation has formed chains of dependency, of coercion with China and other nations that are extremely dangerous. A fourth threat to democracy, the destruction of the public through the destruction of price. This is something that economists might want to turn their attention to. First-degree price discrimination, first-degree terms discrimination by monopolies to provide vital goods and services is leading to the atomization of the public. The issue is not that the price is free, it's that the price is imposed from outside the market. The issue is that price is a function not of competition, but a tool of power. Without a public price, you don't have a public. Without a public, you cannot protect democracy. All of these are the results of a revolution a generation ago in how we do competition policy in America. And let me put a little meat on this discussion about the threat that this poses to democracy by looking at the state of journalism today, specifically at the ways in which Google and Facebook and the way they use their power to affect the news and information. And just to be clear, I speak as someone who has worked in various ways for more than 30 years as a journalist. First, misinformation and propaganda. We have seen our societies hugely disrupted by lies and simple craziness, as we've heard. There is nothing new about misinformation and propaganda. We can read about it in Thucydides. What is new today is that Google and Facebook have built machines designed to use the secrets of the individual to manipulate the individual. These machines have become amazingly powerful, almost perfect mechanisms for amplifying propaganda and misinformation. These two corporations make a lot of money, tens, hundreds of billions of dollars, from renting out these machines to just about anyone who comes along, be it a white power moron or Vladimir Putin. We cannot have democracy if we turn our broadcast platforms over to control by foreign agents and tribalists and anarchists. Second, the starving of journalism. We have seen our society hugely disrupted by the collapse of journalism at the local level and at many other levels. Matt Stoller spoke about this earlier. He said, as he pointed out, 2/3 of all U.S. counties now have no newspapers. You know, what we're talking about is thousands and thousands and thousands of journalists, of reporters and editors who are, you know, on our streets. They're not on our streets. We cannot have democracy without fully independent journalism, regulated by a need to compete in markets. Third, the automation of fear. You know, in February of last year, my friend Nick Thompson, who's the editor of Wired, he published a feature on Facebook. It included this rather concise description of fear. Every publisher knows that. At best, they are sharecroppers in Facebook's massive industrial farm. And journalists know that the man who owns the farm has the leverage. If Facebook wanted to, it could quietly turn any number of dials that would harm a publisher by manipulating its traffic, its ad network, or its readers. That was 14 months ago, 15 months ago. A few weeks ago, Nick updated that piece with an article titled 15 Months of Fresh Hell Inside Facebook. In this recent article, Nick tells us that just after the first article appeared last year, with that quote in it, this is a quote from the new article, traffic from Facebook suddenly dropped by 90%, and for 4 weeks it stayed there. After protestations, emails, and a raised eyebrow or two about the coincidence, Facebook finally got to the bottom of it. An ad run by a liquor advertiser had been mistakenly categorized as engagement bait by the platform. In response, the algorithm had let all the air out of Wired's tires. The publication could post whatever it wanted, but few would read it. Once the error was identified, traffic soared back. Nick concluded by doubling down on what he wrote last year. It was a reminder that journalists are just sharecroppers on Facebook's giant farm. Let's clarify the lessons of what Nick wrote, what Wired experienced. In response to what was a very positive article overall, an article that was structured to provide Facebook with ample room to prove its good intentions, Facebook responded by shutting Wired down and keeping them shut down for a month. Today, in America and in Europe, our newspaper publishers understand something very well. So too our news producers and our book publishers and our online native publishers. Our reporters and editors and book authors, they all understand that someone somewhere has the power to cut off their pathway to the reader and to cut off what little revenue remains in the system. We cannot have democracy unless every one of us, every citizen, feels free to speak their mind every moment, every day. And this is nowhere more true than with influential members of our society. And I'm not just talking about reporters and publishers and authors here. Business executives at major corporations, academics, think tank scholars, none must ever fear to speak their mind for fear of retaliation. And yet every day, more and more people do. You know, so where are we now? We're entering a third stage of monopolization in America. You know, since the triumph of the libertarian movement a generation ago, or the libertarian philosophy in economics, the first stage lasted from 1981 maybe to the crash of 2008. During that period, we saw a consolidation of the democratic economy into what could best be described, as Simon Johnson of the IMF did so in 2009, as an oligarchy made up of a few hundred corporate and banking masters, each in charge of some domain or other. The second stage has lasted from about 2009 to about now. In this stage, we've seen a pyramiding of power into the hands of three great master manipulators who have captured direct economic, hence political control over many of the most powerful actors of the first stage of consolidation. Now we're entering a third stage in which the people and their representatives are awakening to the fact that what we were told, foremost by people in the Chicago school, was an invisible hand of the market is actually a very visible fist. In response, we see the great masters responding with ever more blatant forms of thuggery. More threatened, they become more dangerous. Tyler Cowen earlier spoke about the threats to the rule of law. Amen. The rule of law is very much at stake in our country today. So what do? First, accept the fact that the will of the people will prevail. We will fix this problem, and we will do so soon. Second, We should understand that we do not need any new law or any new institutions. We do not have to wait for Congress to create some new office or other. We have every single tool that we need already at hand. You know, some of them may end up surprising us, you know, if we actually understand that Amazon and the way it uses its power over the people who depend on it is in many ways an extortion and protection racket. Maybe we could figure out a way to use RICO law. Third, the main thing we must ensure is that the providers of essential communications and information services are subject to common carrier-style regulation. There must be no first-degree discrimination in price or terms, be it towards the end user or the provider. You know, breaking up these corporations, that would improve the matters around the margins. But the first thing we must do is outlaw all first-degree discrimination in price and terms. Fourth and last, it's time to get economics out of law. You know, back at least to the time of Abraham, we have struggled to bring law into alignment with justice. You know, a generation ago, we allowed law to be made subject to economics. This concentration of power and control we see today is the result. Going forward, economics can observe, economics can comment, but economics shall never again sit in the seat of judgment.
Thank you. I can't believe it. Barry Lynn gave a stem winder. So I want to start this discussion by sort of reacting a little bit to the last panel, because I think the overriding kind of sentiment on the last panel was this idea that we don't have enough data on this, this political problem that's specifically around social media, and that we need to create some authorities to collect some more data. And it's a very academic solution to what I think is a political problem. And in just these 4 discussions, we heard a lot of data. We heard that there is $129 billion of digital ad spending expected in 2019. We have 10Ks that can show plenty of data on Google, Facebook, and Amazon and the nature of their political power. We have the 2/3 of counties without a news outlet that shows certainly a certain resonant data about the loss of news and information within our society. We have the data of, you mentioned Amazon, and I'm kind of stunned that Amazon wasn't mentioned on the panel in terms of their political power. We know that they have, through something called the Amazon Amendment, created a procurement database for purchases of government, both at the local and the federal level. The FEC is going to be getting pens from Amazon through this procurement database that has been set up, and they will be the sole provider of that. The CIA's secrets are in the Amazon cloud. The idea that we don't have data on the political power of an Amazon is just kind of ridiculous. So I want to hear some reaction to the idea that we don't have enough data about the nature of this problem, and whether am I wrong in thinking that there's a pretty rich data set out there that suggests some sort of concentration of power here?
Well, there's data and data. So, yeah, there's the kind of data that you cited about aggregate numbers of users and the size of Amazon cloud. But I think that Josh is right when he says that we actually have been attributing political consequences to some of these actions where we really don't know whether that's the case. For example, the whole business about filter bubbles and the idea that you're unduly influencing people, using social media. I think a lot of the empirical studies that have been done just in the last year or so have tended to show that, to the extent that this has any effect at all, it actually just reinforces people that are pretty committed already.
Sure.
That very few people are actually persuaded by fake news, things that they read on the internet. And in a certain sense, there was a kind of moral panic over that, and I think that is a little bit dangerous if it, makes you rush to certain solutions.
I think I definitely want Claire to respond to that because she's seemingly panicked about the thing that he just mentioned. Do you think filter bubbles are an overblown
Yeah,
aspect?
I think when I go to panels and people talk about, the terrors of polarization and the terrors of this, we don't know enough about that at all. We know that there's a lot of bad stuff on there. We've got a lot of descriptive data.
But haven't we never known? I mean, 10 years ago, the scourge that would be of like kind of this would be email forwards of re from your uncle about something to do with a viral piece of content, and it would go all over the
Historians will
internet.
look back and say we had this weird 10 years where people publicly said what they were going to do and what they thought. Before that, people were around dinner tables or down the pub in my country, and we didn't know what they were talking about. Then we had this weird time when we thought we could get all the data, like academics were in heaven, and now we're kind of frustrated because it's going back into a space that we can't see. But I mean, I think to go back to what we don't know, in the Brexit example, if nobody's seen Carol Cadwalladr's talk and TED when she talks about it being a crime scene, because in the UK we have spending limits and a crime was committed, but we cannot go back and look at those ads. There's no archive. I mean, a law was broken and we can't see it. So I think these conversations can be, have we got enough data or not? Is this a problem or not? And the complexity means we just need to chunk this off and then start saying, we have this, but not that. But I think otherwise we get paralyzed.
That's valid. So there's obviously what you guys do at the FEC revolves around disclosure. And there's then this question of how do you disclose something that is encrypted, that is a message between two specific people that it's hard to have a similar like-minded experience from one person to the next. So what are the challenges of implementing some sort of disclosure regime over that? Well, let's start there.
Well, we would never do that. I mean, if you're sending an email from one person to another, there's no disclosure requirement there. There's no disclaimer requirement there.
So are we chasing a race that is already 10, 20 steps ahead of us?
You need a different solution for different platforms, I think. I mean, one of the provisions of the Honest Ads Act is that it would require digital platforms to create the kind of archive that Claire was just talking about, so that everybody could see what the ads were. And one of the phenomena that some people probably knew about this, but it got a lot more attention after the last election, was the way with micro-targeting. Individual ads would change depending on who they were going to, and you didn't know what your neighbor was seeing. You would see the ads on your feed, but you would, those would be different from the ads on somebody else's feeds. And so you need to be more flexible in your definitions of what you are looking for and how you're defining it. I mean, if you're looking for things that are exactly identical, then you're never going to capture all that. And that's why having an archive of all the ads would be really useful, I think, and certainly helpful for academics. But another problem that we confront is that while millions of dollars are being spent on digital advertising, there's also, you can get a lot of bang for your buck on the internet, and there's a lot of really low dollar spending that has a huge impact. So I think we have to rethink our parameters for what we want to regulate and whether money is the only indicia of the kind of influence that we want to make sure people can identify where it's coming from.
Okay. Barry, one thing that the committee that put up the white paper did not come to a resolution on was this disposition of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996, and I'm curious as to your thoughts on that. We've seen some targeted chipping away at Section 230 with legislation called Sesta Fosta. It's sort of the first step on not having a full immunity regime. But do you think that there is? What do you think about the trade-offs on Section 230, and where do you think it should go?
Yeah, I mean that's a really tough challenge. I mean, and Frank was obviously trying to get at this in his presentation. And I think, Frank, one, as he said, well, first, maybe we should recognize that Google and Facebook are publishers and should have the responsibilities of publishers. And then he said, well, but they're too powerful, and so therefore maybe we need to then chop them up somewhere. Now, and I'd say there may be an alternative approach to that, which is actually just to strip away their advertising business. That Google and Facebook should not have advertising, should not be in the business of advertising. And advertising should sit on the platform that is the New York Times. It should sit on the platform that is News Corp. It should sit on the platform that is the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. It should sit on the platform that is Vice, that is BuzzFeed. And then it's like all of those publishers, they will attract the advertising to the extent that they're serving the advertisers' needs, and they are also publishers and they're responsible. It's like for the content. Should Google and Facebook be in the, one thing we probably know is that Google and Facebook should not be turned at their present scale into publishers. So, so I think there's a lot of different ways to approach this, and one of the things that will happen is that Google and Facebook will no longer be advertising supported.
Well, I take it a step further and say that targeted ads should be banned entirely. I mentioned the Telecom Act of 1996, and maybe if we're talking about the political power of digital platforms or platforms of any kind, we should be talking about iHeartMedia, which used to be called Clear Channel, and which monopolized the radio dial for talk, political talk in particular. Is reversing that or something along those lines in terms of media consolidation a step that you would be in favor of, because that seems to be the underlying premise of your discussion?
Yeah, so I hope nobody misunderstood what I was trying to say. I actually think that the government has a regulatory role, and that role becomes more important as media concentration increases, which is, again, why it was seen as justified to regulate broadcast TV, but not so heavily newspapers, because newspapers are just more competitive. So yes, I do think that is the case, and I think that the way that the FCC used its power to regulate legacy media should be a precedent for the way it could potentially regulate the platforms, because if you think about it, they're about as concentrated as ABC, NBC, and CBS were back in the 1960s. So in terms of the legitimacy, I think, yes, definitely. What I don't see is where you're going to get the political consensus to do this, and on what grounds you're going to exercise that power.
I suppose the question is whether or not the existing authority is sufficient and Barry says it is, right? So, maybe you could elaborate on that, on how our existing authorities are sufficient to drop these concentrations of power within digital platforms.
Yeah, I think I don't think Frank and I are disagreeing. Frank, so is there the political will? Can we sort of concentrate the political power to achieve this? And that remains to be determined. I think yes. I think it's reasonable for people to have doubts. We have to go organize. The exact pathway, and I think it's like the exact pathway that we're going to get to where we want to go. There's actually maybe 100 different pathways or 200 different pathways. When you look back at American regulatory approaches over the last 250 years, it's usually principle based. It's not sort of approach based. So it's like you kind of know what you want to achieve, and then you use whatever tools you can actually bring to bear at that moment. So what we did with telephones is very different than what we did with the electrical system. So I think that but the thing to understand is that this is actually an area where I agree with Dennis and some of the other people who were talking this morning. It's like antitrust can't do everything. Antitrust, as understood, is what the DOJ and the FTC does. They can't do everything. But what we have to understand is that the American government is our anti-monopoly tool. That's what we created government to protect us from concentrated power. So it's like government in every single, we're a part of its capacities, every single one of its capacities, those are the tools we should be looking at.
We were talking before about how many different parts of the federal government actually has some level of antitrust authority. And
yeah, I mean, it's like, it's like, I mean, we've talked about the DOJ, the FTC, the FCC,
yeah.
but it's like the Federal Reserve, the Treasury Department, the DOD, USDA, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, whatever it's called nowadays. It's like all these things, and also every single state, every single U.S. state, by law, has the exact same authority on an antitrust as the federal government does. That was what the Clayton Act said. It's like, we don't trust. Maybe the federal government will be taken over. Every single state can use this law to achieve these same ends, and we should never forget that the Microsoft case came out of the states and was forced onto the federal government, which was unwilling at the time, which was not happy at the time to take it. So there's an immense number of tools at all these different levels. There's an immense number of approaches. And I think it's like, people have said we do need to study this stuff, and it's like, yeah, we actually need, there's no one absolute way forward. We actually have to figure out, just working together. What are the best set of tools to use? But I have great confidence that the people in this room and the 320 million other Americans out there, we can figure this out.
Claire wanted
And the
to
rest of
add
the world.
something to that.
I think in lots of these conversations, the piece that's always missing is the public. And so when you spend a lot of time looking at this, you realize that as humans, there's lots of great things about us, but there's some really dreadful things about us. And so the idea that actually newsrooms would be, if they were the only ones that were advertiser funded, I really shudder to think what those headlines would look like. They're pretty bad right now because they're clickbaity, because they need eyeballs. I can only imagine if it was that competitive what it would look like. And I would love to make legacy media stronger, but if you spend any time with anybody under the ages of 25, they're not going anywhere near legacy media, and they're going to find a place where they can connect with the types of media that they want. And so, again, when we think about platforms, with the Christchurch shooting, there was a great piece by John Herman in the New York Times who said, we've always had places that you could find suicide and mass death. It just wasn't on the platforms. They were on the internet, and you could always find them. Now they have found a home on the platforms, and it makes us feel uncomfortable because we can see it. But people will always find those spaces. So I think the one thing I think about regulation that I would love to see, because we do need to experiment. We can't just keep sitting on panels saying, woe is us, and then getting drunk afterwards. And we've actually got to do something. And so for me, it's how do we experiment with different models? And we can't get people off Facebook right now because of the network effect. And so we can, and we have some kind of data portability to try. Like that, because if we throw spaghetti at the wall and we realize we want humans to do that, but they're over there eating that spaghetti, like that, we have to have a way that we can actually experiment, because at the moment, public aren't going to go anywhere else.
And one thing about your work, and it is experimental in this sense, is it's sort of a monitoring regime. It's just sort of a spotlight regime of, and I'm wondering how that might scale, bring this into the domestic context of how you could create some sort of independent, I mean, we have fact check organizations, and they're very derided in the United States. So, I mean, how do you build trust? How do you build sort of a monitoring regime that then can be responded to?
So a big part of this is when we all started worrying about this 2.5 years ago, people would talk about media literacy, and then others would say, we've not got time for that, love. Can we just have an algorithmic tweak? Now, 3 years later, we've realized we can't just have an algorithmic tweak, and we haven't actually thrown the proper money at media literacy, and we haven't properly evaluated it. But what I would love to see in terms of when we talk about monitoring can easily become surveillance, and we have to be really careful around that. But rather than putting people through media literacy programs with PowerPoint slides and a game at the end to check whether they've learned anything, what does it mean to actually inform citizens and say, you are part of this, and that actually if you are seeing things in your community groups, then there's a part of them, it's not surveillance, like looking at your neighbor, but at the moment we haven't found a way of bringing the public into this at all. They're not at these convenings, the platforms aren't bringing them into them. Tarleton Gillespie's book about custodians of the internet is excellent, saying, how can we think about governance where the public are part of it? And I just think that in these conversations that's the piece that's missing. And otherwise, or we have paternalistic conversations believing that we're all really good humans, and if we just invest here, they'll all go over there and read news about Syria. They're not going to. So
there you go.
And the other
Yeah,
issue about digital literacy that Nate personally points out in his paper is that the people who most need it are older people.
Yes.
I mean, we always think about,
Totally.
training programs as something that you do in the schools for younger people, but the ones who are most likely to be taken in by misinformation on the internet are older folks who are less adept online.
I've also read that misinformation thrives in news deserts.
Yeah.
And that gets back to Barry's point.
That's the vulnerability before 2020.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. I'd like to go to the audience now. We just have a few minutes for questions. Anybody? I saw a hand go up right here.
I have a.
We'll go to you. I meant her, but that's all right. We'll go. You can go first. And okay. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you very much to the panel. I really appreciated that Claire brought up the issue of smaller platforms, because as someone who studies online hate speech and extremism, one thing we often see is that accounts are banned off of mainstream platforms, and then the same people may open new accounts in these smaller areas. And so when you all are thinking about mechanisms of accountability and regulation, I'm wondering how you take into account this broader online ecosystem, and if these accounts start on Facebook and then are banned and moved elsewhere, are the larger platforms then off the hook? And I just would like to hear a little bit about how you're thinking about
Good
that.
point. Anyone want to take that?
Well, look, I think it's going to be extremely hard to ban bad people from using the internet to meet. I mean, I don't really see how you're going to do that. But if you take it off of Facebook or YouTube, the scope of who they talk to is just going to be smaller. I mean, what you really have to worry about is not the true believers that are going to be hating regardless, but whether their influence spills over into other groups that, they could recruit. And I think the smaller the platform, the less likely that's going to happen. But yeah, of course, it doesn't solve the
And there's also something about the algorithmic prioritization of conflict and polarization that is a feedback loop within these large social media platforms that drags people in,
Yeah.
right?
And actually, there
Yeah,
may
go
be just a real quick is this issue of size. In the case of the size of the platforms, it may actually matter. With the smaller platforms, maybe we do treat smaller platforms as publishers, and the same, and require them to be responsible for what's published on their site. Whereas with a very large platform like a Google, where they have 90% of certain market share, maybe that wouldn't be the way to go.
I guess the question is, there's some anecdotal evidence, right, that actual offline violence is being organized on these smaller platforms. So, and that's again something that we need more data to study, but just wanted to put that out.
More data. Okay.
So I have a question about the difficulty of defining some of the criterion fair and balanced. So this is something that Francis Fukuyama was talking about. And I just wonder, when you take someone like Alex Jones, what he says is not only hateful and damaging, but it's also demonstrably false. It seems to me that that clearly falls outside the spectrum of what are the things that are fair and balanced. I would have no problem in saying that doesn't satisfy the test. It seems to me that organizations like the BBC, I do not remember, I'm sure maybe Claire does, exactly what their mandate is, but I think they must be obliged to present several points of view, but I don't think they would think that Alex Jones his point of view has to be presented. They're wrestling with this kind of issue every day. I think it's even true of PBS in this country. It has some sort of mandate like that, and they seem to be able to satisfy it. So it seems to me it's more doable than you were suggesting.
No, I don't think it's doable in our country right now. And this is the point I was making about these European public broadcasters. You can do public broadcasting in Britain and Germany and Scandinavia because there's an underlying degree of social consensus and political consensus. So these are widely trusted institutions, and people are willing to delegate to them the authority to decide what is simply false and what people ought to be listening to. I just think that in our country, unfortunately, that social consensus is gone. And the measure is not whether Alex Jones is objectively unfactual. In fact, a lot of people are unfactual. He's a lot worse than most other people, but it is a spectrum, and there's a significant number of Americans that think that even if he is lying about these things, he ought to be given an opportunity to present this alternative point of view. So yeah, I wish that we had the kind of society, and by the way, it's changing in Europe in our direction. So right now, ZDF has come under a lot of criticism from the AfD supporters because they do not accept this consensus view that they actually represent grown-up views about what's responsible news and so forth. They've been excluding their particular nationalist point of view and so forth. And so I think that's the big issue. It's where American society is rather than can some adult make a decision as to what's out of bounds and what's not.
How much time do we have for questions? Maybe one more or two more? Okay. Okay, Maurice. And I'll get you.
Sure. Thanks so much. This is a question for Ellen. One of the things that we heard throughout this conference as well as earlier conferences is how economic power can translate into political power. One of the things that we've never had at any of these conferences is someone from the FEC to talk about Citizens United. And based on your perspective within that agency, what impact did that Supreme Court decision have? And is it overstated? Is it understated? Are there unique insights that the public hasn't seen that you could share with us?
I think it's had a huge impact, but not the impact that people expected when the decision first came down. What people thought was that because it empowered corporations to be more politically active, that the might of all of these corporations that we've been talking about and all the other corporations out there, just billions of dollars in wealth, was now going to be thrown at politics. And the reality is that for most big corporations, for publicly traded corporations, they don't want the grief of, they have too many customers, they have too many stakeholders, they have different shareholders with different points of views. They probably have even board members with different points of views. They don't want the hassle of being seen as being out there on political issues or advocating for or against different candidates, because they're not going to make everybody happy. So when corporations spend money, they tend to spend money by giving it through trade associations. The Chamber of Commerce spends a lot of money on politics, and that comes directly from big business corporations, and they're more comfortable spending that way, so it's not pegged to them. But what has happened is, there's a couple of problems. One is that when corporations can spend, that also means it's greater power for C4 organizations, which are dark money groups, and they end up spending more money and we don't know where it's coming from. And I think that's bad for democracy, because I think everybody is better informed when they know who's behind the ads that they're seeing, and they can better evaluate them that way. And it also helps to ensure that we're not getting money funneled in from illegal sources, which has happened, including from foreign sources. But the big winners as a result of Citizens United, because they led to the creation of the super PACs, are the mega donors. In the 2018 election, there were 126 people, individuals or couples, who gave over $1 million through a variety of, through super PACs largely, because you can't give that much to candidates and party committees. There were 12 or 13 individuals or couples who gave over $10 million. And there was one family that gave over $100 million to different political committees that were spending money in our politics. And those are the ones that we know about because they're doing it through disclosed entities. That doesn't even count the ones who are funneling their money through C4s and other organizations where we don't see the donors behind them. We have now a massively supercharged, super empowered class of mega donors who are spending a lot of money. A very small number of people who are spending vast sums of money to try and influence not only who gets elected, but what gets enacted. And the impact of that on policies and on economic inequality, I think, cannot be overstated.
We have time for, I guess, one more question, and I did promise right here. So.
Thank you. I agree with the importance of the issue of media capture, as I see that the newspapers and legacy media being now owned by more and more people involved in politics, or people like we didn't mention, we were mentioning Amazon, but we didn't mention, of course, Jeff Bezos purchasing Washington Post, and Le Monde being purchased by Czech tycoon, for example. So that is spreading. And on the other hand, we have the issue with the new media, where the increasing transparency of ad spending and the foreign interference is something that you are developing here. But Facebook and others are global platforms, and we don't see that sort of response from Facebook in other countries. You cannot get data, and including the foreign interference. Who gives the money, how much, and whether that was coming from Russia or China or someplace else. So I'm not sure who is the authority to, so to speak, to enforce that through Facebook and so on, but it's certainly an issue that will be important for Brazil or throughout Europe or anywhere else where you have this sort of influence from abroad. Thank you.
Claire, did you have a few words on that? Or?
Yeah, I would just say the biggest lever of change here is very strong journalism. But the tech press here are American and they focus English language. So for example, Pinterest changed, anti-vax stuff came off Pinterest and they got lauded. In Brazil, they're like, no, it hasn't changed in any language other than English. And so I would love to see the tech press here understand exactly those issues that you're talking about, because the only thing that makes a difference to Silicon Valley is the American tech press.
And who of those are here?
Great.
Right? Okay, well, thank you very much for all of our panelists, and I think this is a very broad topic, and we just scratched the surface, and we will continue to do so for the next couple days of this panel. So enjoy the rest of the day.